In 536, history witnessed an unparalleled cascade of calamities, earning it the title of the worst year on record. The world grappled with dramatic temperature fluctuations, casting an eerie shadow as the sun dimmed, and volcanic eruptions added chaos to the unfolding crisis. Meanwhile, the Justinian plague, a merciless pandemic, swept across continents, leaving death and devastation in its wake. This confluence of nature's fury and a deadly pandemic etched 536 into the annals of history as a year of unparalleled adversity and despair.
The worst year to be alive depends on who is telling the story. Maybe it was in 1349 when the Black Death wiped out half of Europe, or in 1918 when the flu killed over 50 to 100 million people, or in 2020 when we were all forced to stay indoors. But for medieval historian Michael McCormick, the worst year was 536. But what do you think? According to the archaeologist who is also in charge of the Harvard University Institute for Science of the Human Past, Michael states that this era of the time was one of the worst, if not the focal point or starting point that brought the other atrocities along with it. You ever see that movie Ice Age that squirrel Scrat is desperately trying to bury his acorn, but every time he does it in each movie, he causes a butterfly effect of chaos? That's pretty much what happened in 536. Not the squirrel part, but hey, you never know. It all started when a mysterious fog seeped into Europe, and somehow this mist began covering not just the European continent, but the Middle East, parts of East Africa, and parts of Asia as well. Like a blanket of darkness covered these parts of the world night and day for over 18 months. In a record by the Byzantine historian named Procopius states, "For the sun gave forth its light without brightness, like the moon during the whole year, but because of the lack of sunlight and the provisions of natural heat, the temperatures globally slipped into 1.5 to 2.5 degrees Celsius. Meteorologists and weather reports it being the coldest decades in the past 2,300 years. Everything was flipped. Summers in China befell to heavy snowfalls that greatly impacted agriculture as crops failed, and as a result people starved. And once the fog emerged in 536, the results of bread famines affected many communities, as Irish chronicles noted it was a failure of bread from the years 536 to 539. But where did this fog come from? Apparently, a volcanic winter of 536 caused by a volcanic eruption from early on in the year, causing the decline of the average temperatures in the affected areas and resulting in crop failures and famine for well over a year. But which volcano caused it is still unknown. Apparently, the volcanic winter that was caused by at least 3 simultaneous eruptions of uncertain origin and with several possible locations in various continents. That's really scary to think about if that even ever occurred now. According to Cassiodorus, a Roman statesman, noted in one of his letters, the sun rays were weak and they looked bluish in color. At noon, there were no shadows visible on the ground and the heat from the sun's rays no longer existed. The moon, even when it was full, looked empty, and a winter without storms, a spring without mildness, and a summer without heat. Even if it was originally theorized that the climate changes of 536 AD were caused by the volcanic eruptions or volcanic winter, revisions speculate it might have also been caused by impact events like a meteorite or a comet. Even noting historical consequences marked by scholars and researchers of this time state that despite the chaotic phenomenon, that didn't stop other conflicts from ensuing, like wars and battles. The Battle of Camlann is a legendary final battle of King Arthur, in which Arthur either died or was fatally wounded while fighting either alongside or against Mordred, who also perished. The Gothic Wars persisted, and not the heavy metal ones, but the actual kingdom known as the Ostrogothic of Italy. They also had a conflict between them and the Eastern Roman Empire. So like most of human history, even when the world is in chaos, geographically as well as there are famines, it won't stop kingdoms from engaging into war. Alongside the famines and war, though, also brought forth another issue. Just like in 2020, with the global pandemic forcing everyone to stay indoors, led the ideal conditions of the Justinian bubonic plague, the first plague and pandemic, to spread across the Mediterranean, leading up to an estimated 25 to 50 million deaths, which is actually 35 to 55% of the population. And because of the war I mentioned, the plague is what aided the collapse of the Eastern Roman Empire. Either way, once the volcanoes erupted and covered nearly a good portion around the world, even affecting the Mayan civilization, which as we know is around South America, it sparked even more concern a century later when several more eruptions from volcanoes exploded in 640. I mean, this kind of makes sense when you think about it in regards to all that end of the world revolutionary type of thing, or Day of Revelations kind of stuff when it comes to these holy texts and holy Bibles, is that they were probably stemming from that same era. I mean, with the current times and 536 being the peak year when things blew up, literally, maybe it was a squirrel trying to hide their acorn for the winter that started it all. I'm pretty sure Hollywood, and I'm surprised actually Hollywood hasn't coined a movie based off of 536, but we do have destructive end of the world movies like 2012. In addition to the Mayan Empire, the Mochi civilization once dominated the western coast of South America, contributing to the cultural and economic heritage of the region. The Mochi were avid fishermen and mastered irrigation to grow various crops, including beans and corn. But because of the chaos of 536, massive floods and heavy rains destroyed irrigation networks, making it impossible to grow enough food to feed the population. Famine and climate chaos combined with the ineffective leadership, and the Mochi unfortunately was never able to ever achieve their earlier strength, and therefore the civilization kinda died out. The history of the end of the world does go back about 2,000 years to the beginning of Christianity, although early Christians were certainly not the only group who engaged in apocalyptic predictions. What is meant of the end of the world or the apocalyptic times can vary from person to person. Even if the person is making the prediction doesn't really make sense or doesn't mean the end of all life on Earth, they're almost certain referring to something happening which may have been the end of the world as we know it, or whatever that definition is. To be fair, the end of the world as we know it certainly did happen to many people in history in very localized cases. If a city was sacked by Genghis Khan, for example, it might as well have been the end of the world for them. And to the people who experienced 536 AD and that 18 months long of uncoveted darkness that covered basically every part of the world, and the destruction of the homes and villages caused by the war, oh, and the pandemic plague that affected tens and millions of people, I think it is fair to note that to those people, they definitely thought of it. After all, aside of it being noted as one of the worst of the world's history, it was also noted as the Year of Darkness. But even with the several eruptions that I mentioned happened a century later, in 640, the production of metals like silver was actually made as a form of material and suggested a bounce back and improvement of economic outlook. The things were looking up a century later in some places, and although some regions didn't experience silver introduced in their economies until the 660s, it still worked out in the end. When they say the world is going to end, do you think it's the destruction of volcanoes that'll do us, or the destruction of a man? I guess that is kinda close, but what do you think? Either way, when it comes to 536 AD specifically, it is around the time when a lot of religious and speculations of religion was exploding at the time when it comes to Islamic texts and the Torah and the Judaism, and as well as Christianity, as well as when you think about the Mayan civilization, when you think about the movie like Apocalypto, maybe around the same time with all these chaotic events happening by volcanic eruptions and earthquakes and meteorites and just the chaos of the earth trying to formulate itself, is why a lot of these texts have these end of the world conversations, as I mentioned. But the question is, what about now? Now that we know the scientific research in regards to what caused it, is it still the same thing, or is it something that we should still think about? I don't know. Anyways, I hope this was an interesting historical lesson, as I do love learning and I think you do too. Well, that's all for today. Thank you for joining. Be sure to like and subscribe, and my name is Jess and I wish you all the best.